Now, your knowledge of those glossary items will count for 20% of your final grade. So, just letting you know. I'm sorry? Any jokes? Let me see. I had something mildly humorous that happened to me. You all remember the snow we had, the big snowstorm? My wife always wakes up before I do. She's an early riser. And I woke up, I'm lying in bed, and she's standing there by the bed, and she's got a shovel, and she's got a cup of coffee. And I look up at her, and she says, I have good news, and I have bad news. And I said, all right, give me the bad news first. And she said, there's over a foot of snow on the ground. And I said, well, what's the good news? And she said, you don't have to mow the lawn. Said, you don't have to worry about that. And then she kind of stuck to Now, actually, she offered me the cup of coffee first, and then yeah, my wife is a real cut-up. She loves making with the jokes. Okay, well, we're right about there. Go ahead. Okay. Welcome to everyone. Lovely once again to see you all here today. And today we are going to look at the third and final part of our series on making sense of the political world, an audacious task that we have set before us. We're going to take on the whole world. And there it is, beautiful blue marble, looks so peaceful from a distance. But of course, as we draw closer, we notice things that aren't quite so peaceful. The world, for tens of thousands of years before recorded history, people have been fighting other people. This is true. As far as archaeologists can tell, this has been happening all over the world, every inhabited continent. Wherever human tribes went, human war went with them. And what did they usually fight over? Land. You got it. Excellent. Land. The question was always, which tribe will control this, very desirable piece of real estate? Then, over time, these tribes, humans evolved from tribes into kingdoms and into civilizations. But the war continued. It just got more organized. They got better at killing each other. And the question still was, which kingdom, which civilization, or in some cases, which religion will control this desirable chunk of land? And this went on for thousands of years, all the way up to the two worst wars in recorded human history, World Wars I and, of course, World War II. But these wars injected a new, I can't say it's completely new, but a relatively new consideration into the fray, and that was ideology. Now, if you have the glossary, ideology is defined in your quick guide to jargon there. But basically, it refers to a political system. Very simple definition of ideology. It refers to a political system or a political mode of thinking, a very distinctive mode of political thought. So now ideology became another reason for people to make war on each other. And it's been with us since World War II. We've had a number of ideological struggles. And the best known one, of course, was the Cold War. The Cold War, as you know, was a global standoff between the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And this was very much a global confrontation. The whole world was divided basically into two camps. There were non-aligned nations. There were some nations who didn't want to jump into the Soviet camp, and they didn't really want to jump into the U.S. Western camp, and so they called themselves the non-aligned nations. But even those nations were profoundly affected by the Cold War. So you had the democratic, free enterprise West against the communist, authoritarian East. And it went on for half a century until 1991. And that's when it came to an end, because the Soviet Union collapsed. Their economy just wasn't functioning well enough, and the whole Soviet empire came tumbling down. Christmas Day, 1991. Now you see George Bush Sr., he was president at the time, shaking hands with Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. In my humble personal opinion, Gorbachev is truly a great man, because he could have reacted to the fall of the Soviet Union by just calling out the army, the Red Army, and just killing protesters in the streets. And he refused to do it. Some of his commanders said, we could do this. We can, bludgeon our people into obedience. And he said, no, it's not the right thing to do. So I think in Russia today, they have a low opinion of Gorbachev, sadly. But I think history will remember him as a truly great human being. So people thought, with the end of the Cold War, that this would usher in a new period of world peace. This global standoff that went on for half a century finally come to an end. What will happen now? Hopefully, peace. Nations of the world will finally learn to get along. George Bush Sr., president at the time, called for a new world order, an international assembly, a community of nations that would respect the law, international law. They would live by that law. They would observe, they would respect human rights. This was a very kind of daring vision. But in the early 90s, it looked like it was achievable. And in fact, there was a superb historian at Stanford University, a guy named Francis Fukuyama. And the year after the Cold War ended, he wrote a book called The End of History and the Last Man. And in this book, this was a really kind of audacious book. He lays out this vision of the future, and he foresees, or he suggests that what might happen at this point, remember we're in the early 90s, is that more and more nations will adopt liberal democracy. And because of this, the world will increasingly be in a state of peace. Because more and more countries, Fukuyama believes, will embrace liberal democracy. Now, in your glossaries, and we discussed this in part one of our series, when historians refer to liberal democracy, they don't mean it in the kind of the narrow political partisan sense of, liberals versus conservatives. They don't mean it that way. They mean it in a broad, historical, philosophical sense. For historians, classical liberalism calls for government that rules by the consent of its people, that grants people equality before the law. No one is above the law, but everyone is protected by the law, and allows people to be free. And being free means freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, all the freedoms we enjoy today in America and in Western Europe, Canada, Australia, all the nations of the West. So Fukuyama believed that more and more people would realize that liberal democracy gives them the best chance of living peaceful, prosperous lives within a community of peaceful, prosperous nations. And so his thesis is that as people understand what's at stake, as they understand how liberal democracy works, they will embrace it. They will flock to it. Even people in other, very different cultures, India and China and all over the world, the people will eventually gravitate toward liberal democracy. Now, in his book, Fukuyama admits that liberal democracy does not come easily to the human race. These other systems of government come a lot more easily. This is one of the fundamental lessons of history. Human beings, dictatorship develops among human beings, I want to say naturally, very easily. We see this happening again and again and again in the historical record. Monarchy is another form of government that establishes itself very quickly and easily among civilizations. Oligarchy, ruled by an elite group or one political party, is another system that evolves way more easily than liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is very difficult to establish in human communities and human nations. It takes certain conditions have to prevail. A certain mindset has to prevail among the populace. This is not easily achieved. But Fukuyama believes the ball is rolling. Liberal democracy has the historical momentum. It is growing. In his book, he points out that in the early 1800s, there were only a few countries that could even loosely qualify as liberal democracies. Then, by the early 1990s, when he wrote his book, there were 90 countries that could be reasonably described as functioning democracies. This is an enormous increase over a period of less than 2 centuries. So this is quite striking, and he really takes this into consideration. And he believes this trend is going to continue. It's going to grow. More and more countries are going to embrace liberal democracy because they realize it will serve their peoples best. This is the sentence that I think sums up his book best of all. Liberal democracy may constitute the end point in mankind's ideological evolution and the final form of government. Now, this is what he means when he refers to the end of history. He's not saying from this point on, there will be no more tumultuous or historically noteworthy events happening in the world. That's not what he's saying. There will continue to be historically noteworthy events occurring. What he is saying with that phrase, the end of history, is that the human race, after struggling for thousands of years, has finally found the optimal form of government, the ideal way for human beings to govern themselves. Liberal democracy. We've finally found it, and now this opens up a whole new era of peaceful, prosperous relations among countries. Maybe the end of war. Very, very optimistic view of the future. Well, other historians weren't quite so optimistic. They kind of they all respected Fukuyama. He is a superb historian, but they thought he had gone a little too far. That this was a very kind of rosy view of the future of the human race. One of those historians was Samuel Huntington. He taught at Princeton, and 4 years after Fukuyama's book came out, he wrote The Clash of Civilizations. It became a very, very controversial book, not only among historians, but even among rank and file students of history. And in this book, he lays out his thesis. And this is probably the one sentence that sums up the viewpoint that he puts forth in this book. The most important distinctions among peoples are not ideological, political, or economic. They are cultural. He is saying that we are first and foremost creatures of culture. It is our culture that determines how we see ourselves and how we see each other. Way more than politics, way more than economics. I mean, politics and economics can be seen as elements of culture. But Huntington says that these other strands of culture play even more significant roles in the way people view themselves. And they're all very self-evident. You can read the list for yourself. These are the things that bind people together and that make up a person's sense of himself or herself, by and large. Even the things you would think of as not so important, that celebration celebration of certain days, remembrance of certain days. Every late November, I go shopping like you do, and I'll see a neighbor and I'll see, someone I remember from my past, and sometimes they're Jewish, sometimes they're atheists, sometimes they're, Catholic or whatever. And I think nothing of saying, oh, what are you doing on Thanksgiving? You going to visit the kids? Are you going to, stay at home? Are you going to go see a movie? And they think nothing of asking me that same question because we share that holiday. It's something we both relate to. It's something that means a lot to each of us. So this is just one example of how culture unites us, how it defines us. So Huntington sees civilization as the thing that gives people their highest and strongest sense of identity. And he goes further to say that the world is divided into 9 distinct civilizational blocks. And he lays them out in his book. And here they are. You have the modern, you have the Western liberal democracy, and there you see it up there. That I'm colorblind, so that looks light blue to me, but I'm not sure if it is. Europe, of course, is part of the Western liberal democratic tradition. Australia, New Zealand doesn't appear on the map, but New Zealand would be included, as would, excuse me, Taiwan, South Korea, the Philippines, would all be included today in that Western civilizational bloc. But there are 9 other civilizations around the world. There's Latin American civilization, Sub-Saharan African civilization, Islamic civilization dominates North Africa and a huge swath of southwestern Asia. You have Russian civilization, distinct from the West. Huntington called it Orthodox. Excuse me. He called it Orthodox civilization after the Russian Orthodox Church, which is probably the foremost religious institution in Russia. But most Russians, I think on any given Sunday, maybe 5 to 10% of the Russian people actually attend church. Most Russians today are agnostic, not quite atheists, but agnostic. Excuse me. So then we have, moving down on the eastern end of the map, we have what Huntington calls Sinic civilization, Chinese civilization. Buddhist civilization, which is this kind of grayish color, and that includes Mongolia, Tibet, some countries in southwestern Asia. And then, of course, you have the Hindu civilization in the Asian subcontinent. And finally, Huntington gives Japan its own civilization. Many historians see Japan as being part of the Western bloc today. They've embraced Western values, Western tradition, so forth and so on. But they retain a strong Japanese culture. And so Huntington sees them as being in their own unique category. So these are the 9 civilizations of the world that Huntington lays out in his book. And he then goes a step further. He says, and remember, he writes this in 1996. He says that in the years to come, there will be increasing conflict along cultural lines. In other words, these conflicts will occur in the borders that separate civilizations. He says, expect this. This is going to happen. The conflicts are going to occur, and in the conflicts that are already existing, they're going to get worse. So now this is a very kind of scary prediction he makes. Now, many people pointed out that, well, the West, mainly the United States and Great Britain, have been kind of broadcasting liberal democracy and the values of liberal democracy for years, since World War II. For 70 years, through Hollywood, movies are one of America's biggest exports in the world. And through Hollywood, through TV programs, which are broadcast in many nations around the world, we would have a chance to convert other cultures and civilizations to liberal democracy. They would get a chance to see how we live, the things we believe in, the things we value. And this would have a kind of a conversion effect on them. They would draw more and more, closer and closer to Western values. Well, that's not quite how it's played out over the past 70 years. Some cultures have been profoundly affected, like Latin America. They see the West and they want to emulate the West. They want to have all the things that the West has. And that's, I think, true also in sub-Saharan Africa to some extent. But there are some civilizations that have looked at the West, have watched our movies and our TV shows, and what they see is not very appealing, not very impressive. They see a society of people that are very narcissistic, very egotistical, very obsessed with sex, obsessed with material things, owning more and more, being richer and richer, being more and more famous, And they say, well, if those are the fruits of a liberal democratic society, why would we want to go down that road? Why would we want to be like you, produce a nation of just selfish people who only care about themselves, And primary among those civilizations that have that view are Islamic civilization and Chinese civilization. To a lesser extent, Hindu India kind of has a standoffish view of the West, and of course, Russia, especially Putin's Russia. But mainly it's these two civilizations that not only are they not impressed by Western culture, they believe very strongly that their cultures are superior to Western culture. They say we produce better people, more people who are more unselfish, people who think about the greater good rather than just, I want to be famous, I want to be rich, I want to be this, I want to be that. So they're very impressed by the West's technology. They want that. They like that part of things. They're very impressed by the range and the quantity of consumer products that are available in the West. That really dazzles them. They want that. But they don't want the underlying cultural attitudes. They believe those attitudes are, in the long run, self-destructive. Now, some historians, one complicating factor in all this is the fact that the bastion, you could argue that Europe is ground zero for Western civilization in historical terms. Well, Europe, according to one historian, not Huntington, there was a different fellow who made this observation. He said, Europe is committing demographic suicide. Birth rates in Europe are nosediving. The average woman in Europe gives birth to about one child, maybe a little less than that. In order for a society to sustain itself, the replacement birth rate has to be 2.1, or approximately 2 children per woman. If that's what happens in a society, the population will remain pretty level. Won't go up, won't go down, but it will be a self-sustaining population. You will have an adequate number of young workers entering the workplace, paying into society's social security, social welfare programs. And that creates an economically healthy society. Well, in Europe, that's not what's happening. The number of workers, European workers, entering the workforce is getting lower and lower and lower and lower. Now, to be fair, this is true across a huge swath of the planet. There is the human birth rate is in decline all over the world. Birth rates are going down. The only place that isn't true, you see in the upper left-hand corner, sub-Saharan Africa has a birth rate of 4.3. That means the average woman in sub-Saharan Africa gives birth to 4.3 children. So they're way above the replacement rate. And then Islamic countries have an average birth rate of 3.2. That's, again, above the birth rate, the replacement rate. So those are the only 2 places in the world that are substantially, where the population is increasing. It's not decreasing. In the rest of the world, especially in the West, it's going down. One really striking exception to that, Israel. Israel, apart from the West Bank, apart from Gaza, Israel has a birth rate of 2.8, which is above the replacement rate. It's a very healthy birth rate. Why? The honest answer is no one really knows. It's something about, now, we know the factors that play into birth rate. Education, top of the list. As women become more educated, they tend to have less children, fewer children. We see this across the board in all different cultures and all different societies. Quality of life, material quality of life. As people enjoy a better standard of life, they tend to have fewer children. So those are 2 of the factors. There are several others. I would argue that in Israel, you have the fact that the Israelis very much see themselves as a kind of, I don't want to misstate this, but they see themselves as existing very precariously in this sea of Islamic nations surrounding them. They are kind of standing alone there, the only real democracy in that whole section of the world. And they're acutely aware of the fact that they have to make a go of it, as a nation. And one of the things that means is they have to keep having, a healthy number of children to keep Israel strong. I would argue that's one of the reasons why they have that exceptional 2.8 birth rate. But you can see the numbers for other countries, especially the West. United States, 1.6. Europe, 1.4. And that's very deceptive because in Europe today, the groups that are having the most children are Islamic immigrants. And that gets figured into this number. If you just included native European women, that number would be under 1. It would be about 0.9. So throughout Russia too, Russia has a very, very low birth rate and still going down. And you see this all across the world. So this creates a kind of, the irony of this is that here you have the most advanced nations in the world, technologically, intellectually, some would say culturally, the most advanced nations in the world, and yet they're not producing enough children to sustain themselves. Europe has to import millions of Islamic immigrants to work, to pay, to hold down jobs and pay into their social welfare systems. America, we need to import people from Latin America because apparently, this is something that a number of economists have pointed out, there are lots of jobs that need to be done, but Americans don't want to do them anymore. Americans seem to think, I'm above this, I don't want my son to be mowing someone else's lawn and being a groundskeeper for someone, we'll let those other people take care of it, right? So it's just the irony of this. We have this advanced culture, and yet we're depending on supposedly less advanced cultures to send fresh life to us so that we can continue to exist. It's just terribly ironic. Now, some historians have said, a few, not many, but a few have pointed out that democracy itself might be a flash in the pan, a flash in the historical pan. For thousands and thousands of years, we've been dominated by dictatorship, oligarchy, monarchy, right? We've already pointed that out. Democracy has been around as a real, functioning, thriving system of government almost 200 years. 200 years is a drop in the ocean as far as, the staying power of a governmental system goes. Democracy is a relative newcomer. Those other authoritarian systems have been around a lot longer. So some historians say that democracy might turn out to be a kind of a blip on the historical radar. Something humanity tried and it just didn't work. It didn't work because when you give people everything they want, people tend to become more and more selfish. And they kind of take their really gracious lives for granted, more and more. You hear this from veterans all the time. No one knows the value of freedom like people who have had to fight for their freedom. That's when you really appreciate it. That's when it really sticks in your heart and it means so much to you. But then you see people who didn't have to fight for their freedom. And so often they're very lackadaisical about it. They don't even realize it's an issue. They don't even realize it's something that you sometimes have to fight for. And this kind of lackadaisical complacency that seems to gather strength in democracies might end up bringing an end to democracy. That democracy might end up kind of devouring itself. Now, this is just a conjecture. I'm not saying anyone has strongly predicted this, but a couple of historians have, suggested this may happen. In the meantime, Huntington said in his book that the greatest danger of conflict will be along the borders that divide civilization. He said in his book, 1996, that Islam would be the most aggressive civilizational force in the coming decades. He said more and more, Islam will make war on the West. He said, you're not seeing it now. He said, but it's brewing and it's going to happen, right? He said, Russia. Now this is before Putin. This is mid-1990s. He said Russia, that the Russian kind of, the Russian civilizational reflex to assert itself is going to become apparent. And they will eventually push back on the spread of liberal democracy into Eastern Europe. After the end of the Cold War, liberal democracy spread into these countries. And Huntington predicted that there's going to be blowback. Not yet, he said, you're not seeing it now, but you will see it, and it will be aggressive. He pointed out that China will become America's biggest adversary on the global stage, most powerful, most dangerous rival, that China will challenge America to become the preeminent superpower on this planet. Now, when he said this, China was struggling. China, its economy was in poor shape when Huntington made this prediction in the mid-1990s. Its economy was improving, but it still wasn't very good. So some people criticized Fukuyama's book for being too optimistic. Well, they criticized Huntington's book for being too pessimistic. They said, what the hell is Huntington talking about? Why is he so worked up over this? And if we could get into a time machine and go back to the 1990s, we would understand those criticisms. Because in 1992, Boris Yeltsin, a vigorous defender of democracy, was elected president of the Russian state. So it looked like Russia was on its way to full-blown democracy. China had rejected Marxist economics. They hadn't rejected communism, but they had rejected Marxist socialist economic principles, and they embraced free enterprise. And the hope was that China would go further to embrace liberal democracy itself and become a true democracy in the world. Israel was on the verge of making peace. Remember, we're in the mid-1990s. Yitzhak Rabin shaking hands with Yasser Arafat, and there was talk of Israel making peace with other hostile Islamic factions. Iran, the most aggressive of all the Muslim theocracies, was held in check in the 90s by Iraq. Remember, Saddam Hussein was the dictator of Iraq. Well, he hated Iran. He made war on Iran for several years. Over 1 million people were killed in the 90s. So Iran had its hands full with Iraq. Iran couldn't spend all that much money or energy helping Islamic terrorist groups in other parts of the world because they were fighting for their lives right here on their border with Iraq. So for all these reasons, many people thought Huntington was way too negative, way too pessimistic, and they just said he's worrying about nothing. Well, on a beautiful September morning in 2001, 2 fuel-packed jet airliners were flown into those buildings in New York. We all lived through this. We all remember exactly where we were when this horrible day happened. Did Huntington predict that 2 jet airliners would fly into it? No, he didn't predict that. But he said Islam will become very aggressive and will make war on the West. He said, mark my words, it's coming. it came. 5 years after he wrote his book, it began. This photo was taken in London. This is not Pakistan. This is not, the depths of Somalia. This is London, one of the most civilized cities on earth. And look at the banner. And there were tens of thousands of people for this demonstration. And the purpose of it was to say, we reject democracy. We want Islam. Huntington had it exactly right. This was a cultural division. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about economics. It was about culture. We go further. When Huntington wrote his book, he had never heard of Vladimir Putin. He never did. Well, I guess by 2008 he would have heard of Vladimir Putin. But when he wrote his book, he didn't know who Putin was. Putin was an obscure lieutenant colonel in the KGB. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, he believed that was one of the greatest disasters in human history, the collapse of what was, in effect, the Russian Empire. He said this is a disaster, and it must be reversed. We must resurrect the Russian Empire. And so he devoted all his energies, all his ambitions to achieving that. He inveigled himself into Boris Yeltsin's government. He established his own network of allies, political allies within the government. And then when Yeltsin stepped down, Putin took over. First democratically, but once he had his hands on the reins of power, he never let go. For the past quarter century, he has been the virtual dictator of the Soviet Union. He made war on Crimea in 2014. He threatened nuclear war against the West if they intervened. Then he began making inroads into the Donbass region of the Ukraine. And then, of course, as we all know, February 2022, he launched an all-out invasion on the Ukraine. Huntington predicted Russia would react aggressively to the spread of liberal democracy into Eastern Europe. And that is exactly what happened. And it's happening to this very day. Putin tells his people on a weekly basis, he says, the West has insulted us. The West thinks we're savages, that we're ignorant, that we're lost in the past. And he says, we have to reclaim our national dignity, our national pride. And he says, if that means going to war, then that's what it means. And he gives this message consistently to the Russian people. Xi Jinping in China gives the same, not exactly the same, but essentially the same core message to the Chinese people, that the West, the liberal democratic West, is a threat to China, that their values, their way of thinking will undermine Chinese civilization, and that China needs to reassert itself, needs to reclaim its dignity and its identity. He began giving this message in 2012. That's when he became the chief man in the Chinese oligarchy, the Communist Party, which rules China. Now, he is virtually the new Mao Zedong. He is for all intents and purposes, he is a dictator in China. You still have that oligarchic structure, but he is clearly calling the shots in China. And he gives his people the same message, that China needs to arm, needs to get ready for a war, because the West is the enemy. The liberal democratic West is the enemy. China, over the past 20 years, its economy has grown by leaps and bounds. This graphic was produced 4 years ago, but since then, the Chinese gross domestic product has improved even more. They are on our heels. America still has the #1 economy in the world. China is right on our heels. And there's no number 3. Japan is way down the list. The next biggest economy is way down. If this were a foot race, you'd have China, America and China, and then 2 miles behind you'd have Japan, Germany, Great Britain. So clearly, this is the showdown that Xi Jinping wants. He wants to establish China as the most dominant superpower on Earth, kind of supplanting the United States. And the difference is we're promoting liberal democracy, hopefully. Hasn't always been the case, but today I would argue that is, for the most part. China is not promoting liberal democracy. They're promoting authoritarianism, authoritarian rule by force. And China is establishing a new world order to challenge the world order that George Bush Sr. called for 30 years ago. Bush wanted a rules-based system of international order. Well, China wants a system based on a power structure whereby China is on top. China is at the top of the totem pole calling the shots. And you can see he's made great efforts to create this new world order. Of course, Vladimir Putin, the mullahs of Iran, Kim Jong-un of North Korea, Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela. He's been removed from power, but Venezuela and Cuba are still basically in China's camp. And he is currying favor with a lot of Latino leaders. And this is Viktor Orban of Hungary. So he's even making roads into some authoritarian European countries as well. So he's making enormous strides to create his new world order. And again, I remind you of the prediction Huntington made that the biggest conflicts in the world would occur along the borders that separate civilizations. Well, you didn't need a crystal ball to say that China and Taiwan would be at loggerheads, right? That was no great feat to predict that. China has been threatening Taiwan since 1949, well over 7 decades. But Huntington was right to see this as a profoundly cultural division, not just a military standoff, much more deeply and meaningfully than that. The people of Taiwan, according to polls that have been taken, do not see themselves as Chinese. They see themselves as Taiwanese. They say we have our own culture. It is distinctly different from communist Chinese culture. And they have, by and large, embraced liberal democracy and the values of the West. So this isn't just a military political thing. It is a cultural thing. Huntington was absolutely right about that. North and South Korea, the Korean War started 70 years ago, and it has never ended. But Huntington was right to see this. Yes, it's a military conflict. Yes, it's an ideological conflict. But it is also a profoundly cultural conflict. The South Koreans, by and large, overwhelmingly have embraced liberal democracy and liberal democratic values, whereas the North Korean government is one of the most, if not the most, authoritarian government on earth. Islam versus Israel, we know all about this, of course. No one would argue that this isn't a cultural problem. It is. It is a military problem, but it is also very, very much a cultural problem. The Islamic, many, and I mean millions, tens of millions of Islamicists see Israel as an insult to Islam. In Islamic theology, once Islam conquers a piece of land, it must always remain Islamic. Well, Israel was reclaimed. and it is now no longer predominantly Islamic. It is a secular Jewish state with elements of religion, certainly, but they have an independent judiciary. It's not a theocracy. It is a secular Jewish state. And for many Islamicists, this is unacceptable. Israel must go away. So again, this is a cultural conflict. And Huntington was absolutely right to see it as such. Another flashpoint in the world goes back all the way to the 8th century. I'm talking about India, Hindu India against Islamic Pakistan. Well, this goes back 13 centuries. That's when Islamic armies invaded Hindu India. They wanted to convert. They wanted to forcibly conquer India and turn it from a Hindu country to an Islamic country, which they had already done in many, many other countries around the world. And they wanted to do it in India. But the Hindus fought back. The Hindus armed themselves and fought vigorously. This is the worst religious war in recorded human history. Millions of people have been killed, and they're being killed right up to this day. They're not being killed in the same numbers that they were back in the 8th and 9th centuries, but there is still a very dangerous standoff right here on that border between Pakistan and India. It's one of the most heavily armed borders on earth. And occasionally there are fights. Occasionally there are terrorist acts. And both of those countries are armed with nuclear weapons. So very dangerous flashpoint in the world, and very much a divide of cultures. Not just military, not just politics, culture. So that Huntington, once again, very prescient. And I don't even have to say this, but we see what's happening in Russia. Putin thought he was going to conquer the Ukraine in 3 weeks. I thought he was going to conquer the Ukraine in 3 weeks, quite honestly. I'm astounded and gratified that the Ukrainians have been so brave and put up such a great fight. But if he does manage to conquer the Ukraine, he will almost certainly go after this section of this parcel of land right on off the Black Sea. This is called Moldavia. He also wants the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. So if he does get the Ukraine, he will turn on those countries afterward. But again, we see this cultural, civilizational conflict occurring. Liberal democracy on this side, authoritarianism on this side. And then finally, we have, no one saw this in the 1990s. No one predicted this. Huntington predicted it. One of the worst places in the world in terms of this active, ongoing conflict between two different civilizations is being waged in the Sahel region of Africa. That's the area of Africa just south of the Sahara Desert, right across the African continent, from Western Africa to the Horn of Africa in the east. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people are killed every year in this fighting. This is a conflict between Islam in North Africa and sub-Saharan African civilization to the south. And Islam is trying to conquer more and more of Africa. And that's why you have this ongoing war. Every year, at least 10,000 people are killed, sometimes many, many more. The foremost, arguably the deadliest terrorist group at work in the world today, in terms of people killed, is a group called Boko Haram, and they're centered in Western Africa. They do most of their killing in Western Africa, mainly Nigeria. Boko Haram literally translates into Western education is forbidden. One of their main tactics is to attack schools and to take children hostage. They've taken hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of school students hostage, mostly girls, mostly young girls, and they force them to convert to Islam and to have children to create more Islamic warriors for the future. That's their goal. If this isn't a cultural conflict, there is no such thing. This is very much a war of civilization, not, just which warlord is going to control Nigeria. That isn't the question. The question is which way of thinking is going to control Nigeria and the other nations in the Sahel region of Africa. Samuel Huntington passed away in 2008. So he didn't live quite long enough to see all of his predictions come true. But when his book came out, he was assailed in some quarters. People called him a xenophobic alarmist, that he was a reactionary and this and that. Many people, many historians, his colleagues at Princeton defended him very vigorously. They knew him, and they knew he wasn't just this crazy reactionary or anything like that, that he was truly a brilliant historian. If you ever read his book, The Clash of Civilizations, his grasp of historical knowledge is absolutely breathtaking, absolutely staggering. I marvel. I also feel that way about Fukuyama. But to draw this talk to a close, there is very much a new Cold War at work in the world today. The first Cold War ended, but now it's been replaced by a new and potentially even more dangerous Cold War. And how this is going to turn out is anyone's guess. I mean, only time will tell. But this is where the conflicts lie. This map was put together by Amnesty International. And you see the light blue country, the light blue signifies full democracies or flawed democracies. And then as you get into the reddish color scheme, that's where you see the more authoritarian nations of the world. The world is pretty much right now evenly divided between countries that are liberal democracies or struggling to be liberal democracies and authoritarian nations that are ruled by theocracy, dictatorship, oligarchy, or just one-party government. This is the way the world looks today. This is the geopolitical situation today. It's no longer free enterprise, democratic West against the communist East. Now it's liberal democracy against authoritarianism, whatever form it takes. That's the real dividing line in the world today. And Huntington was right. That dividing line cuts between the civilizations of the world. On that note, today's talk comes to an end. Thank you. Thank you. If anyone has any questions, any observations you'd like to make, yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit about where the dividing line is between culture and religion? Because much of Huntington's map was divided by religions, and then you called it culture, but I'm sure there's some distinctions you want to make about that.
Yeah. Yes, there is. Culture and religion are not interchangeable, but Huntington did say, and almost everyone would agree with him, that religion is probably the single biggest determiner of culture. Not the only factor, but probably the biggest. It's what defines people's self-image, how they see themselves, how they see other people. So that is still, especially where Islam is concerned. I hate to say that, I don't mean to sound Islamophobic, but it is very worrisome to me that I want to say the majority of Muslims, clearly the majority of Muslims in the world are peaceful people. They don't want war. They don't want to be hurt. They don't want to hurt anyone. They just want to live and let live. But there is a substantial minority that truly believes it is their sacred obligation to spread Islam over the world, that is the meaning of life, for Islam to eventually, for the world to become Islamic. What they see is the meaning of life. There was a poll taken, an international polling group questioned rank and file Muslims in, I think, 6 different countries. And one of the questions they asked is suicide bombing justified in some circumstances? And something like 40% of the people of Bangladesh said yes. And percentages in other countries were lower, but not that much lower. So if you have a religion that has 1.6 billion people, and if 25% of those people believe they have a moral religious right to make war on you, that's a lot of people. That's way more people than Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and Imperial Japan had in World War II. And that's why it is very worrisome. I don't mean to, I'm not Islam bashing, but I'm noting that reality. Islam is often the elephant in the room. It's the reality that we're not supposed to talk about, or we're only supposed to talk about it in a certain way. It's the religion of peace. It's the religion, we can't say the truth, that the most violent religion in recorded history, right down to this day, it is Islam. All those beautiful Muslim people, those millions and millions and millions who live peaceful lives, they live peaceful lives not because they're Islamic, but in spite of their Islamic training and teaching. Read the Quran. There are so many verses in the Quran that say you must make war on the unbeliever. Bring the unbeliever to heel. The infidel is the worst enemy, and you must defeat the infidel. When, after 9/11, reporters interviewed Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, and they said, many Muslims are saying, you're not a good Muslim, you're not a good Muslim, you're betraying Islam. And Osama bin Laden looked at them and said, what Islam are they talking about? The Islam of the Quran or the Islam in their imagination? He said, look at what Muhammad did. Muhammad made war. Muhammad was a warlord. Osama bin Laden said, I'm just following in his footsteps. How can I not be a Muslim? How can I be a bad Muslim when I'm doing what the founder of our religion did? And the reporter couldn't answer him. Yes, sir.
Rick, you've got very little dark blue up there.
Yeah, not enough to.
The nation that says it's supposed to be the greatest democracy for the rest of the world is a flawed democracy.
It is a flawed democracy. Good point. And the reason why is because, remember, this was put together by Amnesty International. Amnesty International is profoundly opposed to capital punishment. Any country that allows capital punishment is seen, as far as Amnesty International is concerned, they're seen to be a flawed democracy. That's the flaw.
So on that basis, the Vatican would be dark blue?
That would be dark blue. That's correct. Yes.
Well, first of all, you answered my question because I was going to ask the same thing, but also, how much does religion impact the birth rates?
Great question. Religion is a big factor in birth rates. One of the reasons why Islamic women tend to have so many children is that their religious culture expects it of them. You're supposed to, crank out kids one after another, and they do. The country with the biggest birth rate, the greatest birth rate on earth is Somalia, one of the poorest countries on earth, but they have a birth rate of average 6.1 children per woman. So Somalian women are just expected to produce more and more kids, future warriors for Islam. Yes, sir.
Dealing with the birth rate, I was surprised to see that South Korea has the lowest birth rate in the chart.
South Korea is having a huge problem. For some reason, young South Koreans just don't want to have kids.
Is that religious or is that?
No, in that case, it has nothing to do with religion. It has everything to do with their embrace of the modern Western lifestyle as just the freewheeling pursuit of pleasure.
How about, they produce so much
Yes.
economically, are they immigrating people? How are they getting
Not great numbers. And that's one of the they are getting people from the Philippines, from some other Asian nations, but by and large, the South Korean government is working very, very hard to create programs that will incentivize their young people to have children. And Japan is doing the same thing. They're moving heaven and earth trying to get their younger men and women to have children. There's a documentary you can see on YouTube, I believe, about how the Japanese government is trying to achieve this. And the journalist interviews young Japanese men in the streets. And the journalist asked, don't you want to be a dad? And they say, no, no, I don't, because it would affect my lifestyle. I want to have a good time. I want to party. I want to, meet as many women as I can. And kids get in the way. For those of you who are parents, having a child is the biggest responsibility you will ever have in your life. And they want no part of it. So, yes, ma'am. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll get to you in just a moment. Yes.
Islamic women are expected to have many children, but
It is affected by other factors like education, like Turkey, where women are well educated. The birth rate goes down to about 1.7, something like that in Turkey.
well, I'm thinking of the role of men in this situation,
Okay.
and they are the procreators of these children, and what is the parallel of very male-dominated, male-controlled areas that the women are under subjugation to very strong male dominance, political and cultural and religious control. How much, when you say women are expected, I don't know how much these women have the ability to prevent them from having all these children. So
That is an excellent, excellent point. Yeah, the fact that these are patriarchal societies, male-dominated societies, it certainly adds to that number considerably. If a woman were to say to her husband, no, I don't want to, cohabit with you, the results would probably be pretty ugly, maybe even violent. Yeah, so that women understand if you don't follow the prescribed road, that you could be in for a bad time of it. You could be in for a real beating. The Quran says you can hit your wife, you can strike your wife. Now, some Islamic analysts say, well, yeah, but not hard. You can't hit them too hard, Well, I don't think it says that in the Quran. It just says in certain circumstances it is justified to strike your wife If she needs to be brought to heel, you got to do it. So yeah, the fact that it's a patriarchy is a huge factor. You're absolutely right. And I promised you, yes.
Spending a lot of time on birth rates. I think the Israeli rate is probably inflated by the Hasidic community. I think if you divide the Hasidic community, the Orthodox community, from the rest, the secular society, those rates would be highly divergent.
That's true. That's a very good point. Ultra-Orthodox Israeli women tend to have almost 6 children per woman. Very high birth rate. Yeah, yeah. But even rank and file Israelis are doing pretty good in that regard. They too are achieving almost a replacement birth rate. So, and we could do a whole talk on just why that is. Many analysts are looking at that and trying to figure out, why is this happening in this one place in Western civilization? And it's a fascinating question. Yes, ma'am.
I think there's an ethos to
I'm sure there's something to that. Yes, the 6 million who died. Yes. Any other? Yes, ma'am.
this is not about childbirth anymore, so everybody has something to say about that.
Childbirth.
Go ahead, but this has to do with the flawed democracies. Can you hear me now? Maybe too much. But compared to, you were talking about the worst ones, how do the non-Islam flawed democracies compare with those countries in terms of percentage of violent sects within them, the minorities within them that are very violent?
I'm not sure I got how do the flawed democracies in Islam?
No, I mean just in general. How do they, or any country that you have up there that's light blue, how do they compare in the percentage of very violent, cruel, very fanatic, what you want to call them, terrorists is the best word. Is the percentage of people doing terrorist acts or cruel violence to other people, is the percentage much lower in those other light blue countries as compared to the Islamic countries? That's what I want to know. Okay. All right.
Yes. It is much lower. The percentage of terrorist groups in the light blue countries that are killing people on a weekly basis is much lower than it is in the Islamic countries. Now, I'm not saying there aren't terrorist groups in the light blue countries. There certainly are, and they're certainly, they have to be watched, and they're a menace. But if you read the New York Times, if you read the Globe or the Wall Street Journal, at least once or twice a week, you'll see a little clipping, page 3, page 4, page 5, a little article will say 70 farmers killed in, Nigeria. You'll see that every week. You'll see it, and that's all it gets. Because I hate to say this, but killings in Africa just don't matter that much in the West. It's just not a big deal. If 70 people were killed in Paris by a terrorist group, it would be the lead story on CNN tonight. But because they're African, it barely gets a mention. And yet it occurs every week. I clip those articles. I have a file at home that is this thick. All these little newspaper clippings of all these killings that occur in Africa. It amounts into the hundreds of thousands. So these groups in Africa and other Islamic groups are terrible. Just a few days ago, there was an Islamic suicide bomber in Pakistan, went into a mosque. There was another Islamic group, but apparently their theology wasn't correct. And he went in, exploded his device, and I think 20-something people were killed in the mosque. So yeah, it's a real problem in the Islamic world. It's a real problem.
Cultural thing, right? People who value human life.
Yeah, It is a lot about the value of human life. And a lot of Muslims do value human life, but others put the religious obedience above the value of human life, which is tragic. I will get to you in just one moment. We'll have two more observations. And then
This map is fascinating, but as I look at it, I see some, what I think are anomalies. Could you explain what's going on in Mongolia? That light blue?
Mongolia, well, they are making an effort to kind of move toward liberal democracy. The right effort is being made.
Russia and China, so
I know,
Yeah.
I know. It's an anomaly, to be sure. But yeah, Mongolia, small countries, less than 2 million people, but they are trying. So I give them so much credit. Yes.
What do you think that might happen if China invades Taiwan or Russia invades Estonia or Lithuania?
What do I think will happen?
Yeah.
I hope-
Will they have to go to war?
I hope NATO, including America, responds, not with nuclear weapons, but with force. Yeah, we have a treaty to respond, and I hope we honor that treaty.
How about Taiwan?
Joe Biden was asked when, in the second year of his presidency, a reporter asked him, if China invades Taiwan, will you send American troops to defend Taiwan? And he said, yes. He didn't blink. He said yes. Now, a lot of his foreign policy people afterwards said, ooh, we have this policy of being kind of ambiguous about what we would do if China invaded Taiwan. And that policy has kept China guessing for the past 70 years. But I give Biden credit for having the guts to say, if China were to do that, we would be there. We would defend Taiwan. And I hope future American presidents abide by that same understanding. Because Taiwan, 23 million people, small country, but they are free. They are free people. They have all the freedoms we enjoy, all of them. And to see that community of free people be crushed by an authoritarian power and no one does anything except complain, that would be an absolute tragedy. Absolute tragedy.
It won't be easy because we're all the way across the world.
Yeah, we're not in a good position to defend Taiwan, that's true. But, all right, one last comment. We gave up Hong Kong. That was by treaty. The British owned Hong Kong at that point, and they gave it up by treaty in 1999. And China promised that they would allow Hong Kong to keep its freedoms. Well, within a few years, all those freedoms disappeared. Yeah. So that tells you a lot about how much China can be trusted. Not very much. I thank you all for being here today. Thank you.